My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 32 years old when I started keeping a private list in my phone called Things People Said That Made Me Lose Faith in Humanity. At first, it was just supposed to be funny. A harmless little collection of ridiculous comments overheard at work, family dinners, grocery stores, banks, the kind of things you tell your boyfriend late at night while lying in bed and laughing into your pillows. But after a while, I realized something uncomfortable. The stupidest things people say are usually the moments when they accidentally reveal exactly who they are. And once you notice that, you can never unhear it. The first story on my list came from an old coworker named Melissa. Melissa was sweet in the way overly optimistic people often are. She wore floral scrunchies, drank peach-flavored energy drinks at 8 in the morning, and believed every problem in life could be solved with good vibes. One afternoon, she complained about a headache so severe she could barely look at her computer screen. I handed her an aspirin from my purse. An hour later, she walked back to my desk, looking genuinely offended. "That medicine didn't work at all," she said. I frowned. "Your headache's still there?" "No," she replied. "The pain went away on its own." I remember staring at her face, waiting for the joke. None came. Around us, keyboards clicked endlessly beneath fluorescent office lights, while Melissa stood there, completely serious, as if modern medicine had personally failed her. Back then, I laughed about it. Now I think about how many people refuse to acknowledge help because they'd rather believe problems magically disappear by themselves. A few months later, another story made the list. My friend Ethan once bet $20 that a stop sign had 6 sides. $20. Not 2. Not 5. 20. I laughed so hard I nearly choked while explaining to him that stop signs were octagons. He lost the bet, groaned dramatically, and accused me of weaponizing geometry. 3 months later, we were drinking beer at a rooftop party downtown when he suddenly pointed at a stop sign across the street. "You remember that stupid argument?" he asked. I smirked. "The one where you lost $20? "No," he said confidently. "The one where you were wrong." I blinked. Then he added, with complete sincerity, "Stop signs have 6 sides, Claire." He bet another $20, and somehow lost the exact same argument twice. The scary part wasn't that he was wrong. It was the confidence. People will cling to nonsense with astonishing determination if admitting they're wrong bruises their ego. That lesson came up again years later when the copier at my old marketing job broke during a busy Friday afternoon. The office had run out of paper, and everyone was already stressed because our regional director was visiting. While we scrambled around looking for extra printer paper, one of the interns, a painfully serious guy named Trevor, looked at us and said, "Why don't we just put a blank page into the copier and make more?" Silence. Real silence. Even the copier sounded offended. Someone actually stopped walking. Trevor adjusted his glasses, waiting for praise, completely unaware that every person in the room was trying not to scream. And the worst part? He had graduated from a private university that cost more than my car. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the argument between my cousin Rachel and me during Thanksgiving. Rachel was a child psychologist, brilliant, polished, intimidating. She had the kind of calm voice that made people instantly confess things they didn't plan to say aloud. At the time, I was working as a veterinarian. After dinner, we ended up alone in the kitchen washing dishes while rain hammered against the windows outside. I told her about a rescue dog I'd treated earlier that week, a terrified German shepherd with broken ribs that flinched every time someone lifted a hand too quickly. Rachel sighed dramatically. "You just don't understand," she told me. "It's different when your patients can't tell you what's wrong." I slowly lowered the plate I was drying. The rain outside suddenly sounded louder. "Rachel," I said carefully, "I work with animals." She blinked, then blinked again. I watched the realization crawl across her face like a painfully slow sunrise. To her credit, she laughed afterward until tears rolled down her cheeks. But I noticed something important that night. Intelligent people can say unbelievably dumb things when they're too focused on themselves. That realization followed me everywhere. Especially during the summer, I met Daniel. Daniel Hayes. Tall, sarcastic, emotionally guarded Daniel, who somehow always looked like he hadn't slept enough, but still managed to make every room feel warmer. We weren't officially together yet when one of the most ridiculous conversations of my life happened in front of him. I was standing in line at a convenience store after work when the cashier started flirting with me. He asked where I was from. England, I answered. Oh, he said brightly, what language do they speak there? For a moment, I genuinely thought he was teasing me. Then I saw Daniel behind me in line. He burst into laughter so suddenly he had to lean against a refrigerator door to breathe. I should have been embarrassed. Instead, I started laughing too. The cashier still didn't understand why. That was the first time Daniel and I ever laughed together. Funny how the beginning of relationships often hide inside stupid little moments. Of course, not every misunderstanding was harmless. One afternoon at a grocery store, I overheard a woman asking her husband how factories put the lines inside oranges so people could separate them into slices easily. I remember staring at the oranges afterward, wondering how someone could live long enough to pay taxes without understanding fruit. But then again, maybe human beings survive by simply pretending certainty. That thought hit me hardest during my years working part-time at a bank. A man came in, trying to cash a check written to his grandfather, who was hospitalized. I politely explained that we couldn't cash it unless the grandfather himself was present. The man nodded thoughtfully. Then he reached down, picked up a small terrier dog, and proudly announced, "I have his permission. See? This is his dog." Even now, years later, I can still picture the absolute confidence in his face. Like he'd solved the legal system. I tried so hard not to laugh. "Sir," I finally managed to say, "a dog is not a form of identification." He looked genuinely disappointed in me, as if I were the unreasonable one. And maybe that's the strange thing about these moments. Nobody ever thinks they sound foolish while they're saying it. Not even the assistant manager at my retail job. I was counting register money late one night when I found an unusually shiny penny mixed in with the cash drawer. I held it up beneath the fluorescent lights. "Wow," I said casually. "That's the shiniest penny I've ever seen." My assistant manager gasped. Her eyes widened with actual concern. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Do you think it's counterfeit?" I stared at her for 3 full seconds. A counterfeit penny. Imagine the level of desperation required to illegally manufacture a coin worth 1 cent. The effort alone would bankrupt you. But she remained completely serious. And for some reason, that tiny moment stayed with me longer than bigger disasters ever did. Because that's how life works sometimes. The comments that linger aren't always cruel. Sometimes they're just absurd enough to remind you how lonely it can feel inside your own brain. Especially when you start realizing the people around you may not see the world the same way you do at all. And I still didn't know then that the most unforgettable thing anyone would ever say to me would happen years later over dinner. Long-distance relationships teach you strange things, like how silence can become heavier than arguments, how a delayed text can ruin an entire evening, how loneliness eventually changes the way your voice sounds when you answer the phone. Daniel and I learned all of that the hard way. About a year after we started dating, he took a temporary architecture contract in Seattle while I stayed behind in Chicago. At first, we promised each other the distance wouldn't matter. We were adults. Stable adults. The kind of couple who used words like communication and commitment with embarrassing confidence. For the first few weeks, we called constantly. Morning calls, lunch break calls, late-night calls that lasted until one of us accidentally fell asleep with the phone still connected. Then work got busier. Calls became shorter. Messages became practical instead of affectionate. "Did you eat?" "Long day. Call you tomorrow." Sometimes I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, trying not to calculate how many miles existed between us. One night, after an especially brutal week at work, I stepped onto my apartment balcony while we talked on the phone. The city below me glowed silver with rainwater and headlights. "I miss you," I whispered. "I miss you too." I looked up at the moon hanging over the skyline. It was huge that night, bright enough to soften the edges of the buildings around me. Trying to sound romantic, I smiled and said, "If we both look up right now, we can still see the same moon together." There was a pause. Then Daniel asked carefully, "The same moon?" I laughed softly. "Yeah." Another pause. Then he said, completely serious, "Wait, you mean the exact same one I'm looking at?" I blinked. "What other moon would there be?" "I don't know," he muttered defensively. "I thought maybe different states saw different moons." I nearly dropped the phone laughing. I laughed so hard, my neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind. Daniel groaned in embarrassment. "Claire, stop. You thought America had multiple moons?" I was tired. "You have a master's degree." "Okay, now you're being cruel." For the next week, I sent him moon emojis every single night. But underneath the laughter was something warmer, something comforting. Because relationships aren't built on grand romantic speeches the way movies pretend they are. They're built on stupid conversations, private jokes, tiny humiliations you survive together. At least, healthy relationships are. Not all relationships survive that kind of honesty. I learned that lesson during college from a professor named Dr. Evelyn Porter. She taught communications theory and carried herself like she belonged in an old black and white film. Elegant scarves, perfect posture, sharp lipstick. The woman terrified everyone. One semester, she became obsessed with Pirates of the Caribbean. Every lecture somehow circled back to pirates. Negotiation strategies? Pirates. Power structures? Pirates. Conflict resolution? Somehow still pirates. Then one morning, she handed out the syllabus and said, "These are the parlays you are expected to follow in this classroom." The room went quiet. I frowned down at the paper. Attendance parley. Homework parley. Bathroom break parley. At first, I assumed it was some obscure academic term I didn't know. Then, halfway through class, another student nervously raised his hand. "Professor, do you mean guy blinds?" Dr. Porter looked offended. "No," she corrected. "Parleys." The poor guy shrank back into his seat. For an entire semester, that woman genuinely believed the word parley meant rules or instructions. Nobody corrected her again. Not because we respected her authority, because we were afraid she might fail us out of spite. Even now, every time I hear the word guidelines, I think of pirates. And honestly, that still wasn't the most emotionally damaging thing someone said to me. That honor belonged to Daniel's mother, Linda Hayes. The woman had mastered the terrifying art of sounding sweet while saying something devastating. When I first met her, she hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "Oh, you're even prettier than Daniel described," she said warmly. Then she looked me up and down and added, "You're much older than I expected, though." I was 29. Daniel nearly choked on his drink. Linda simply smiled and continued eating salad like she hadn't just committed emotional manslaughter. At first, I convinced myself she didn't mean harm. Some people simply lacked a filter. Some people spoke before thinking. But over time, I started noticing a pattern. Every compliment came attached to a knife. "You're brave for wearing your hair that short." I admire women who don't mind looking natural. "You have such a strong personality." Strong personality. The universal phrase people use when they secretly mean difficult. Things became worse after I got pregnant. The pregnancy itself was miserable. Movies never show the ugly parts honestly enough. The vomiting. The exhaustion. The way your body stops feeling like your own. Daniel tried to help, but his architecture firm had him working brutal hours. Some nights he'd come home after midnight to find me asleep on the couch, surrounded by crackers and antacid bottles. I felt ugly constantly. Exhausted constantly. emotional all the time. And after our daughter Sophie was born, things became even harder. Nobody warned me how lonely early motherhood could feel. The entire world suddenly expected me to become selfless overnight. Feed the baby, hold the baby, love every second, smile more, sleep less. Meanwhile, my body still felt wrecked and unfamiliar. 18 months later, I gave birth again. Our son, Noah. 2 children under 2 years old. I barely remember that year clearly. Everything felt blurred by exhaustion. One afternoon, only a day after I returned home from the hospital, Linda came over carrying flowers and casserole dishes. I looked horrifying. Hair tangled, dark circles beneath my eyes, a newborn sleeping against my chest, while Sophie screamed somewhere in the background because she'd dropped yogurt on the floor. Linda sat beside me on the couch. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you're not really a mother if you only have 2 children." I stared at her, completely stunned. She sipped tea calmly while I sat there leaking milk through my shirt and trying not to cry from exhaustion. Then she added, "When I was younger, women handled much more." I almost laughed. This woman had 6 children, and according to Daniel, she'd barely raised any of them herself. Most of the responsibility fell onto Daniel's father, a quiet, exhausted man who looked permanently sleep-deprived in every family photo. Not to mention the fact that 3 of the children weren't biologically his. But Linda spoke with absolute authority. That's the thing about some people. Confidence disguises hypocrisy beautifully. I remember looking down at Noah sleeping in my arms while Sophie cried in the kitchen. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I felt this crushing loneliness. Not because motherhood was hard, because everyone around mothers expects perfection while offering judgment instead of help. Daniel came home halfway through Linda's visit. One look at my face and he immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked carefully. Linda smiled brightly. "Oh, nothing," she said. "We were just talking." Talking. Such an innocent word for emotional warfare. That night, after his mother left, Daniel sat beside me in the dark nursery while Noah slept nearby. "You don't have to impress her," he said quietly. "I know. She criticizes everyone." "I know." But tears still slid silently down my face. Because even when you know someone's unfair, their words still live inside your head afterward. Especially during the vulnerable seasons of your life. And I wish I could say Linda's comments were the worst part of knowing her. I really do. But they weren't. Because months later, she said something during dinner that made the entire room fall silent. Something so horrifyingly inappropriate that even Daniel couldn't defend her afterward. And somehow, she didn't even realize what she'd done. By the time Linda Hayes came to dinner at our house for the first time, I had already spent months preparing myself emotionally. Not for cooking. Not for cleaning. For surviving her. That sounds dramatic, I know. But people like Linda exhausted you in ways that were difficult to explain to outsiders. She wasn't openly cruel enough to hate. She wasn't malicious in obvious ways. Instead, she floated through conversations, casually dropping comments that left emotional bruises hours later. And somehow, she always seemed confused when people got hurt. Daniel used to defend her constantly. "She doesn't mean it like that. You know how Mom is. She grew up differently." Maybe. Or maybe some people become so accustomed to saying whatever enters their minds that they stop recognizing the damage entirely. Still, I tried. I always tried. Especially because, by then, Daniel and I had built something real together. Not perfect, but real. Our children were finally sleeping through the night. Daniel's work hours had stabilized. We'd started talking about buying a larger home, somewhere quieter, outside the city. For the first time in years, life almost felt steady. Which, in hindsight, should have terrified me. Because peace never lasts long in families like ours. That evening started beautifully. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, while jazz music played low through the speakers. The dining table glowed beneath warm pendant lights, and for once, the house didn't feel chaotic. Sophie colored at the coffee table. Noah waddled around carrying a plastic dinosaur larger than his torso. Daniel stood behind me while I cooked, stealing bites of roasted potatoes straight from the pan. "You're impossible," I muttered. "You love me. I tolerate you. That's basically marriage." He kissed the side of my head before walking off toward the living room. Small moments like that used to undo me completely. Not grand gestures, not flowers, just quiet familiarity. The comfort of being known. Linda arrived 20 minutes late, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and enough perfume to announce her presence before she entered the house. "Claire," she said warmly, kissing my cheek, "this place looks wonderful." Then her eyes swept across the living room. "So much beige, though." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I ignored it. Practice had made me talented at ignoring things. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Linda told stories about Daniel as a child, while Sophie giggled uncontrollably every time embarrassment flashed across his face. For a while, I almost relaxed. Almost. Then somehow the conversation drifted toward my late husband, Michael. Even years later, hearing his name aloud still felt strange sometimes, like opening a door to a house that no longer existed. Before Daniel, before motherhood, before Chicago, there had been Michael. My first love, my first marriage, and my first devastating loss. He died in a car accident when I was 26 years old, 3 weeks after our anniversary. There are moments in life that divide your existence into before and after. That phone call was mine. I rarely spoke about him in detail anymore, not because I'd forgotten him, but because grief changes shape over time. Eventually, it becomes less like drowning and more like carrying invisible weight everywhere you go. Manageable, but permanent. Linda, unfortunately, loved asking questions. "Oh, Claire," she said gently over dinner, "I always wondered, was the funeral very difficult for you?" Daniel immediately looked nervous. He knew that tone. Curious Linda was dangerous Linda. I set down my wine glass carefully. "It was," I admitted quietly. The room softened into an awkward silence. Rain tapped steadily outside. For a brief second, I thought maybe the conversation would move on naturally. Instead, Linda leaned forward sympathetically. "And was he buried?" Daniel inhaled sharply. I already knew where this was going. "No," I answered softly. "Michael was cremated." "Oh." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "And where are the ashes now?" The question itself wasn't offensive. People ask that sometimes. I glanced toward the hallway cabinet near the living room entrance. "They're there," I said quietly, "alongside our cat's ashes." Immediately, I regretted saying it. Because Linda stood up. Actually stood up. "Oh, let me see." Daniel froze. "Mom." But she was already walking toward the cabinet. My stomach tightened instantly. The cabinet held 2 urns side by side. Michael's was larger, dark blue ceramic with silver detailing. Our cat Oliver's ashes rested beside it, in a much smaller white container, decorated with tiny paw prints. To any emotionally functioning adult, the distinction was painfully obvious. Linda crouched down in front of the cabinet, while the entire room watched in growing horror. She picked up the small urn first, tilted her head, then looked at the larger one, and with complete sincerity asked, "Which one is your husband?" Silence. Absolute silence. Even the rain outside seemed to disappear. I felt my body go cold so quickly it was almost physical pain. Across the room, Daniel looked like someone had punched him in the throat. Linda turned around slowly, still holding the cat urn in both hands, completely unaware that she had just detonated a bomb in the middle of dinner. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Then Sophie asked innocently from the coffee table, "Mommy, why's everybody making weird faces?" That nearly broke me. I stood up too quickly, my chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "It's the blue one," I said quietly. Too quietly. Linda blinked. Then realization finally hit her. The color drained from her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. She immediately put the cat urn down like it had burned her hands. "Claire, I didn't mean—" "I know," I interrupted. And somehow, that made it worse. Because she truly hadn't meant anything cruel. There was no villainy in her voice. No mockery. Just horrifying carelessness. The kind that accidentally cuts deeper than intentional cruelty ever could. I walked into the kitchen before anyone could see tears forming in my eyes. Behind me, I heard Daniel mutter, "Jesus Christ, Mom." The kitchen suddenly felt too bright. Too small. I gripped the edge of the counter while trying to breathe normally. It wasn't even the question itself that hurt most. It was what came rushing back afterward. The hospital hallway. The police officer avoiding eye contact. Signing cremation paperwork with shaking hands because I physically couldn't process words anymore. Grief is strange like that. You think you've healed. Then one careless sentence opens the wound exactly where it used to be. A few moments later, Daniel entered the kitchen quietly. I kept my back turned. "I'm okay," I lied. "No, you're not." His voice sounded tired.
Embarrassed.
Angry. Not at me. At the situation. At his mother. At himself for not stopping it sooner. I laughed softly, though tears were sliding down my face now. "You know the worst part?" "What?" "She really didn't mean any harm." Daniel leaned against the counter beside me. "I know." That somehow makes it more depressing. For a while, neither of us spoke. In the living room, I could hear Linda apologizing repeatedly to herself under her breath.
Mortified.
Sure.
Ashamed. But still not fully understanding why the moment felt so devastating. Daniel finally looked at me carefully. "You want me to ask her to leave?" Part of me did. God, part of me absolutely did. But another exhausted part of me suddenly saw the entire situation differently. Linda wasn't evil. She was emotionally careless. There's a difference. One hurts you intentionally. The other hurts you because they never slowed down enough to think about your pain before speaking. And honestly, sometimes that second kind of person is sadder. Because they move through life damaging people without even noticing the wreckage behind them. I wiped my face quickly before the kids could wander into the kitchen. Then I took a long breath. "No," I whispered. "Let's just finish dinner." Daniel studied me for a moment. Then he wrapped his arms around me carefully from behind, resting his chin against my shoulder. And standing there, in that quiet kitchen, listening to rain against the windows, while the ghost of my old life hovered somewhere inside me, I realized something painful. The comments people remember forever usually aren't the loudest ones. They're the quiet sentences spoken casually, right before everything inside you shifts. After Linda's question about the urns, dinner never fully recovered. We all tried pretending it had. That's what families do when something terrible happens, but nobody wants to acknowledge the full emotional damage out loud. You pass the potatoes. You refill wine glasses. You discuss weather and traffic and television shows, while everyone silently replays the moment in their heads. Linda became unnaturally quiet. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Just deeply embarrassed. She barely touched her food afterward. A few times I caught her glancing toward me with this awful mixture of guilt and confusion, like she still couldn't completely understand how a simple question had managed to wound someone so deeply. And honestly, that was the tragedy of Linda Hayes. She loved people. I truly believe she did. But she moved through conversations carelessly, as though words had no lasting weight once they left her mouth. Meanwhile, I remembered words for years. Sometimes decades. Especially the ones spoken during vulnerable moments. After dessert, Linda offered to help clean the kitchen. I almost said no automatically, but something in her expression stopped me. For once, she didn't look sharp or judgmental or socially oblivious. She looked old. Not physically old.
Emotionally old.
Like someone suddenly realizing they'd spent years saying things without fully understanding the effect they had on people. We washed dishes quietly together while Daniel put the kids to bed upstairs. Rain still tapped softly against the windows. "I really am sorry," Linda said finally. I rinsed soap from a plate. "I know. I loved my husband very much," she added softly. "I can't imagine losing him young."
There it was.
A rare moment of honesty without performance attached to it. No criticism. No hidden insult. Just sincerity. I dried my hands slowly. "The strange thing about grief," I said carefully, "is that it doesn't stay dramatic forever." Linda looked at me quietly. "At first, it feels huge," I continued, "like it's swallowing your entire life. Then eventually, it becomes smaller, quieter. You start functioning again." I stared out the dark kitchen window. But the small moments still destroy you unexpectedly. Neither of us spoke after that, because there wasn't really anything left to say. Later that night, after Linda finally left, Daniel and I sat together on the living room floor, surrounded by abandoned toys and half-folded laundry. The house was finally quiet. No cartoons playing. No crying children. No forced politeness. Just exhaustion. Daniel leaned his head back against the couch cushions. "I'm sorry." "You didn't do anything." "She embarrassed you." I looked toward the hallway cabinet where Michael's urn still sat untouched beside Oliver's tiny paw print container. "It wasn't embarrassment," I admitted softly. "Then what was it?" I thought about the answer carefully. Because the truth was complicated. It reminded me how easy it is for people to accidentally hurt each other. Daniel frowned slightly. "She didn't mean to." "I know." "That should count for something." "It does." And it did. Intent mattered. But consequences mattered too. That was something adulthood taught me repeatedly. People often judge themselves by intention, while everyone else experiences them through impact. Those two things rarely match as neatly as we want them to. For a while we sat in silence. Then Daniel suddenly laughed under his breath. I looked at him. "What?" He shook his head slowly. "I was just thinking about that cashier asking what language England speaks." Despite everything, I laughed. A tired, genuine laugh. Then he added, "And your friend losing the stop sign argument twice. That man should have been medically evaluated." Daniel smiled. "You know what's weird?" "What?" "All your stories sound funny at first, then halfway through, they become sad." The comment lingered in the air between us. Because he was right. Every single story I'd collected over the years carried something heavier underneath it. The coworker who dismissed medicine because she wanted simple answers. The arrogant friend, incapable of admitting he was wrong. The professor too proud to accept correction. The mother-in-law who confused criticism with wisdom. Even Linda. Especially Linda. None of them were truly stupid. Not really. They were human.
Careless.
Lonely.
Defensive.
Insecure.
Sometimes selfish. Sometimes distracted. And occasionally so trapped inside their own perspective that they forgot other people had inner worlds just as fragile as theirs. I think that's why certain comments stay with us forever. Not because they're shocking, because they reveal something. About the speaker. About ourselves. About relationships we thought we understood. A week after the disastrous dinner, Linda called me unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer, but eventually I did. Her voice sounded hesitant. "I was wondering," she began awkwardly, "if maybe you'd let me take the children to lunch sometime." There was something vulnerable in the request. Something careful. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, while Noah chased Sophie through the hallway, screaming about dinosaurs. "Sure," I said finally. Relief flooded her voice immediately. Then, after a pause, she added quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." I stayed silent. "You were right," she admitted. "I don't always think before speaking." That may not sound like much, but for Linda, it was practically a spiritual awakening. And strangely enough, that conversation changed our relationship more than all the previous arguments combined. Not instantly. Not magically. She still made inappropriate comments sometimes. Still asked intrusive questions. Still accidentally offended cashiers, neighbors, doctors, and probably several innocent strangers at grocery stores. But after that dinner, she started apologizing faster, listening longer, pausing before speaking. Tiny improvements. Human improvements. The kind that actually matter. Years later, after Daniel and I moved into our new house in the suburbs, Sophie found my old phone while digging through storage boxes. "What's this note?" she asked. I looked over and immediately recognized the title. Things People Said That Made Me Lose Faith in Humanity. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. "Oh no," Daniel muttered from across the room. "Not the moon story again." Sophie grinned mischievously. "What moon story?" Daniel pointed at me dramatically. "Your mother once laughed at me for believing different states might see different moons." I was exhausted. "You were 31! He covered his face, while Sophie collapsed into hysterical laughter beside me. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I realized something important. Maybe the reason we keep these stories isn't to mock people. Maybe it's because they become emotional timestamps. Little snapshots of who we were during certain chapters of our lives. The lonely years. The grieving years. The falling in love years. The exhausted parent years. The moments we felt misunderstood, and the moments we finally understood each other a little better. That night, after the kids went upstairs, I opened the old note one last time. So many ridiculous memories filled the screen. The aspirin. The stop sign. The counterfeit penny. The dog used as identification. The moon. The urns. I stared at them for a long time, before finally realizing something that should have been obvious years earlier. The dumbest things people ever said to me weren't the moments I remembered most vividly because they were funny. I remembered them because of how I felt standing there when they were spoken. Lonely. Loved.
Embarrassed.
Heartbroken.
Exhausted. Human.
And maybe that's what relationships really are in the end. Not perfect conversations. Not flawless understanding. Just imperfect people accidentally hurting each other while continuing to try anyway.